Okay, so you believe that something can be divine revelation and also simultaneously be corrupted? And corruption of a text is defined as an addition, omission, or alteration done to said text by somebody that is not the author. So do you guys agree that a text can be corrupted and also simultaneously be from God?
The entire Muslim faith depends on the belief that the Bible has been corrupted. And that's what this Muslim apologist is going to try and prove right now. But there's some fatal flaws in her argument that these Christian women are going to expose.
In Joseph's story, when this sovereign is addressed as Pharaoh, you're making the argument now that somebody added this in to make it more adaptable to the people in the time and so on and so forth. But it's original to the text that the sovereign in his time is called Pharaoh, which is historically inaccurate according to Egyptologists, which is why when she mentioned the surah of Yusuf, the Quran comes and corrects this, and he calls the leader in the time a king instead of a pharaoh, because the term pharaoh, although it did exist in the time of Joseph, it never denoted a ruler or a sovereign. It denoted the great house or the great temple. So it would have been incorrect for the Bible to address pharaoh.
However, let's talk about that.
You could point out that by the time of Moses, the term pharaoh did denote a ruler or a sovereign of Egypt. And so if he uses that word to refer to previous ones so his people can understand, where's the sign of corruption? Now, let me know how you respond in the comments. And right now, we're going to see how the Christian responds, but also how they expose a fatal flaw with the Quran as well.
Because you're getting into semantics, right? We know that throughout the Bible, the Jews, or from the Torah, the Jews do not use the name Yahweh very often because they considered it too sacred to read aloud. So instead, they called the Lord the Lord. But that doesn't mean that they did not know who he was. So if we see that this particular writer is calling someone a pharaoh so that it is more palatable to the people that are going to be reading it in that region because they know of kings as pharaohs, then that's okay. It doesn't change from the message or the overall context of the book. But what happened with the Quran, and we know that we have to address this,
yes.
What happened with the Quran is that it was burned. You're aware of that. Uthman, you know this. You're a scholar.
Uthman, when he standardized the Quran, he burned everything apart from
exactly.
So apart from the manuscript of the Prophet, peace be upon him.
Sure. So when we're standardizing something, it is very convenient to burn all other potential references so that we cannot possibly check if we still have the correct context of the text. Do you see where I'm getting with that?
Okay, perfect.
You can
but
say,
the issue is, let me address
Pharaoh, but you have no idea what your original Quran might have said.
Now, to that challenge, you're about to hear a response that sounds good, but I want you to pay attention to the lack of evidence and the flaw in the logic.
Perfect. We actually do, because if you actually read the hadith that talks about the burning, he says that he burned everything.
But
I am comfortable with hadith. Yeah, I'm comfortable with every single authentic hadith.
About which
I'm a Sunni Muslim, so I accept every single authentic hadith. But let's go back, because you're quoting, hold on. So when you're quoting a hadith, you're going to take the entirety of the hadith. The hadith that you quoted about the burning, that is from a narration, and it specifies that all manuscripts were burned except for the manuscript of Hafsa that belonged to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, which means that we have an original text.
Her answer lacks evidence and her answer lacks logic. It lacks evidence because Hafsa, the wife, one of the many wives of Muhammad, who had a copy of the Quran, we don't have her manuscript to be able to compare Uthman's version to her version. We don't have her manuscript because it was also burned. It lacks logic because it was burned in order to hide the differences. So how can you say that it confirms Uthman's version when it had to be burned so that people wouldn't argue over the differences? What did they have to hide? That leads to Cora's next question, which she thinks actually proves the Quran, but in actual fact does the very opposite.
We're talking because you brought up the topic of burning and not having originals. Do you guys have an original of the New Testament?
The oldest copies that we have of the New Testament, or of the Gospels specifically, are in Ethiopia, written in Ge'ez, and they do confirm what is currently in the old or in the New Testament.
And what is that dated to?
I'm not quite sure.
Okay, so the first instance, because we have nothing from the first century of Jesus, the first instance that we get a manuscript of one of the New Testament books, we have one of John that's about this big, and it is a couple of verses from John. No, it's credit card sized. It's credit card sized. It's P52. Yeah, that's the first fragment that we get. So we don't have a complete copy until some people say like Codex Sinaiticus and so on and so forth, which is compiled, right? Some manuscripts are from earlier, some manuscripts are from later. But you made a point about not having originals and so on. So how can you have an issue with us having a standardization process that a lot of people, such as textual critics of the Bible, actually praise Islam for and say that Christianity does not have this, but rather Islam does? How can you have a problem with our standardization process when you don't even have a copy of the Bible from the first century and we have the entirety of the Quran from the first century Hijri?
Imagine I said to you, I read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and you said to me, well, how do you know? Because you didn't have the original paper that he wrote on. Well, I would say, it's the same thing as you see in the millions of copies that are out there. The more copies you have, the more you can compare them to see what the original said. And that's where any forgeries or any fakes stick out like a sore thumb. That's what textual criticism is in the case of the Bible. And we have thousands of manuscripts to help. You can't do that with the Quran because they tried to burn them all, specifically to hide those differences. But this Christian brilliantly lays out the trap every Muslim falls into when they try to say that the Bible has been corrupted.
My position is just very straightforward. Surah 6:115 says that the words of Allah can never be altered. So I think it's convenient that if the Quran affirms that the revelation of the Torah and the Injils are revelation, they conveniently are altered, yet the Quran is not altered. Okay. Secondly, I wanted to just inquire do you know who discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls?
No, not
okay.
Sure.
Interesting story. So the person who actually discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls is a man named Muhammad. He was a shepherd. Yes, he was a shepherd who was searching for his lost goat. Now, if that's not the gospel, I don't know what is. Amen. He ended up finding the Dead Sea Scrolls in a cave, and what he found dates back to 250 AD, which matches the modern Bibles that we have essentially exactly. So we have the first Muhammad who actually affirms the Torah and the Injils, such places like Surah 7:157. I'm sure you know it.
Yep.
The unlettered prophet. He's written about, yes. And then we have the second Muhammad that confirms what was actually found. A Muslim man actually finds the very text that his descendants are going to now call corrupted. And I feel like that is God's sense of humor all over that. Okay. So perfect. My perspective is that the Quran actually obviously affirms the previous scriptures, and the second Muhammad finds those previous scriptures for the world to see.
Perfect. So what's interesting is you touched upon Surah 6 verse 115, correct? Yes. Surah 6 verse 115 says that Allah's words cannot be changed. What's interesting is if you read that verse in context, verse 114 says that that's talking about the Quran. So 115 says that these words cannot be changed.
So
114 says that
the previous revelations were not God's words?
No, I believe that the previous revelations were God's words.
Does the Quran confirm that the previous revelations are God's words? I just want to know.
Yeah, wait, hold on.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm gonna say yes.
The previous scriptures are God's words. However, Allah does not promise to preserve the previous scriptures. Why? Because they're not meant for us.
That's very convenient. That's so
convenient. That's the problem with that.
Not only is that inconvenient, it also contradicts something she said later on in the debate.
Yeah, the text was within the time of Moses, right? Because
verbally
wait, no, not by necessity, because the Quran specifies that the Torah was entrusted to a group of individuals to preserve. The Quran specifies that.
So when it's convenient, it was preserved. When it's not convenient, it wasn't preserved. That's what we're dealing with, guys. In order for someone to corrupt the Bible, you'd have had to taken all the Greek manuscripts, all of the translations in Syriac, Latin, and all the other versions, burn them all, issue your own version, get that out, and force people to adopt that without anybody challenging you. And that never happened in the history of Christianity. But that does sound a lot like Islam. And this is coming from the same person who said that Jesus didn't even claim to be God. But to see that objection brilliantly dealt with, check out the video on the screen. I'll see you there. Peace and blessings.